in doing the work, whatever that might be, I grew a little bit of my expertise about my journey. And in finding freedom, that's the foundation, that each person becomes the expert in their journey. There is that layer of theology as well, isn't there, where we get confused about emotion in the church, and so anger doesn't feel good, so we think God doesn't like it in a blanket kind of way, and we ignore the times that God gets angry. And there's a long history in Europe of therapeutic communities that support people recovering from trauma. Now, here in America, therapeutic community is usually found in prisons or in specialist addiction communities, but it's not usually in the area of mental health. There's a few, but it's not so common. I think in Western society, we compartmentalize and we label things. People come to us and they've had a label and they say, I'm one of these. Do everything we can to avoid the labels. We'll often say sorry to someone for a label that has conditioned them, and then we feel like we become the label. I'm one of these. Well, no, you're not. You struggled with these symptoms, and the label might helpfully describe a cluster, but we are not our label.
So Finding Freedom, previously termed RAFA, started in the 80s when Peter Holmes, a pastor from London with a psychology background, started healing discipleship and had a belief in complete wholeness. Susan Williams was one of his clients starting in 1988 when she was suicidal and close to her second nervous breakdown. Susan went on to continue her doctoral work and has been partners with Peter in his therapeutic work. They support in a community and a journey, and they help with mental challenges, addictions, PTSD, trauma, and all sorts of things. And basically their philosophy, and we'll get into it with Susan, is empowering people and them owning their journeys, growing with others like a community healing environment, and their goal is emotional, spiritual, relational help. And the results they've been able to work with people have been amazing. Hi, Susan. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's nice to be with you. That's a great introduction. Thank you so much for that.
Nice. So let's just start with your own background, because it's always interesting how some of our greatest trials become kind of our empowerment later in a way that we can help others. Yep. So you had your own journey starting in 1988 with Peter. Can you give us some of the cliff notes or share some parts of that with us?
Sure, love to. So prior to that, Tara, I'd had my first nervous breakdown when I was 21. I didn't know what a nervous breakdown was. You never know until it happens to you, do you? And in that moment, to put it simply, I started screaming and I couldn't stop. I was overwhelmed and I had no understanding. It's kind of embarrassing. I had no understanding at all about what was happening to me or why. It was a complete mystery. Now I look back and I have a ton of understanding about what had built up in my life over the years. But at the time, I was in the hands of everyone else. The health services in England did everything that they could. The churches and friends did everything that they could. I was on a lot of medication, and gradually I pulled my life back together from that desperate, heartbreaking kind of place. I was away from work for 2 years because I was too ill for a long time I was too ill to even leave the house. But what I hadn't realised over the 5 years that I'd gradually progressed in getting better, I hadn't realised that all the damage was sitting just beneath the surface again, covered over by this thick blanket of medication, increasing medication because the longer you take it, the less effective it is. And then my father died very suddenly, and the whole lot exploded again, which was devastating. Because when you're there a second time, you know what's going to happen. I knew what a nervous breakdown was. And I had 2 friends who, independent of each other, quite supernaturally, they said, you have to go see this man who lived in the same town, in the same part of London as myself, Peter, and his wife, Mary. I went round one Sunday afternoon for tea, which felt very bizarre. I'm about to get institutionalized, and I knew I didn't want to come out of hospital because I knew it couldn't make it work again. My life didn't work. God didn't work. And the problem was me, of course, not God. I knew that. But I went round for tea, and Peter said to me that first afternoon, he said to me, God does not want to teach you to cope. He wants to heal you, which was, wow. I mean, that really was.
Yes.
Every time I say it, it still impacts me. God does not want to teach us to cope. He wants to heal us. And I'm afraid I was at such a low point that I didn't have any capacity to believe that. But I could see that Peter believed it. And I'd spoken to so many people over the years who tried to say the right thing to me, but I didn't really believe it. And Peter did. You just know, don't you, when someone does. And so I had nothing to lose. I mean, it sounds very melodramatic, but it's very true. I was dying emotionally and spiritually, and it would have just been the end. So it started a journey, and I like in the introduction you use that word empowerment. That's what it was for me, because I'd felt strangely disempowered in all the help that I'd received, because everyone else was the expert and I was the recipient, grateful recipient of their expertise. But their expertise never became my expertise. It continued to sit with them. And Peter's approach was radically different. He would give me a question, he would make a suggestion, and then he'd send me off to do the work. And in doing the work, whatever that might be, I grew a little bit of my expertise about my journey. And in finding freedom, that's the foundation, that each person becomes the expert in their journey. So I bumped into, so much. I bumped into so much of my buried emotion I didn't realize was there. I'm horrified to say the amount of anger that I carried really deeply under the surface was explosive. It really was explosive.
Did it seem like that on the surface, or did you have like the Christian look of
I was very well behaved, Tara. My mum used to say that I was the child on the street that never had a temper tantrum.
Oh, but it was all there and you were, yes.
I mean, I'm sure I did,
Yes.
but it was very well managed. And it was so well managed, I didn't know I was there. It was there, or I was there, truth to be told. And there is that layer of theology as well, isn't there, where we get confused about emotion in the church, and
Yes.
so anger doesn't feel good, so we think God doesn't like it in a blanket kind of way, and we ignore the times that God gets angry, and our theology gets a bit muddled up. So the anger was buried. I had to admit to myself that I'd been raped when I was a child, and I'd never.
Had you remembered that at the time, Susan, or was that during your journey that came to your awareness, or was that?
It was during my journey. There were lots of evidences of it. And I had fragments of memory that I'd never put together. Things that I was frightened by, little moments of micro trauma about ordinary things in life that I'd never been able to explain. So all the signs were there, but I'd never put them together until actually fairly far on in my journey. Suddenly there it was, and all the details came together, and I was horrified to.
Wow. At 5 years old?
Yeah, it was a bit older than 5. I think I was maybe about 6 or 7.
Gosh, I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But that was probably below the surface too, all of that you were covering up with theology and that nice veneer.
Absolutely. And then there was some more ordinary stuff, I got bullied at school, which we shouldn't use the word ordinary, but we do. We kind of normalize it. I was incredibly shy and fearful as a child, and I didn't quite understand why. I was the eldest, and my mum had done absolutely the best that she could, but she didn't have the best childhood and growing up either. And so there was some damage and conflict there. There was just all of these layers that I didn't know. And so Peter's approach was to help me to walk through each of those layers one at a time. We think of it like a house, an emotional and spiritual house, where all the damage has got put in the different rooms, and we walk into one room at a time. If we're doing a journey with the Lord, then we invite Christ into that room with us, and we clean up and redecorate that room so that it is the way that it was originally created to be. And then we move on to the next room, and then the next room, and then we might scoot back to the first room because we discover there's a little bit more. And all the time we're growing in our own expertise about our own emotional health and empowering and relationship with God if we choose. It was a very intense journey, but it was miraculous.
Mm. For me, my life was the kind girl doing the right things, being a Christian, marrying a Christian guy. And really, the relationship was very destructive to me. And I ended up in the psych ward twice and got labeled bipolar at the time. And it was just a very challenging, awful situation. And so we weren't going to, there wasn't mutuality in working things out. And so I chose a divorce. And then I just questioned myself. I questioned all the whys and questioned my beliefs that got me there, and all of my people pleasing and my serving, and really had to rediscover myself and healthy relationship with God and myself and others. And it was a process. So I created the Unravel notebook, and that was the process that helped me go from that situation to living a life abundantly as a realtor and a life coach, and really thriving in a beautiful marriage. And that's what I want to help others do as well, and create their life by intention to live brighter one day at a time. Yes, and I read your book about your journey, and then I also read Changed Lives, and that was fabulous. A lot of stories about other people that have been changed. But basically cleaning up the house and empowering, I think that's so interesting because, like, even in my own story, I had everyone telling me, oh, your marriage isn't that bad, you're bipolar, all of these things.
Yep.
But yet I knew in my heart, I'm like, this is terrible for me. This is very traumatic for me.
Yep.
And letting but not like listening to myself, giving away all my power. It wasn't until I took ownership of where I was at in my my own experience that I could start progressing and asking God, hey, how should I look at this differently? Like, how do I look at it through your eyes and help me to clean up? I thought of it also as like layers of onion.
That's right.
I take off one layer and work on that, and then surprise, there's another layer. And I love your metaphor of the house, because that's so true. It's like we have different pieces. We have a basement. We have a blueprint. That was probably planned, that we didn't really get to choose, but we get to work on that. So that's really amazing.
Yeah.
So you did your own journey, did your own healing work with Peter, and then you've become, a teacher, leader in finding freedom, helping others with their journey for many years.
First of all, Tara, let me say I'm so sorry for your experience. And I resonate deeply with what you say about we when we're bruised, we defer to other people's experience and their wisdom because we feel like we've lost all of our own. And if someone can come alongside and help us to make that connection with our own inner wisdom and thought and experience and the traumas and the barriers and the triggers, that connection propels us into a journey that's way more transformative than relying on someone else's wisdom. So I agree. Yes, the thing that amazed me, Tara, in my journey was that I knew that I'd been like very sick, and I had this label now of, oh, here comes Susan and she's very sick. And so as this journey started working in my life and I started finding radical change, I assumed, oh, this is for people who are very sick. And I sat down with a friend. We were actually having pizza one afternoon. And I was telling her a little bit about what was going on in my life. And I was talking to her about the death of my dad, and that I'd never grieved, and that God was leading me into this deep grief for the sudden loss of my dad. And this was the layer, the room of my house that I was dealing with at the time. And I look up from my pizza and she's got tears streaming down her face. And her mum had died many, many years ago when she was a teenager. And she said, I've never grieved. And could you help me? But she was one of the people that I looked up to who, she had a great family and relationship with God. And I never thought of her as needing anything that was going on in my life. And I think that was a like aha moment for me, because I thought these ways that I'm pressing into healing and that God is bringing it so generously in my life, this isn't just for people who are as sick as me. This is like for anyone who wants to move in transformative change, whether from a place of real sickness or just because they've got an area of damage in their life that they want to heal, that's just been sitting there minding its own business all these years. Or even someone who's not got an area of problem, but they just know that they're not pressing into the fullness of their potential. Because it's all about, how do we change? How do we grow? How do we become more of the person that we're created to be? And of course, if we want to, how do we press into a deeper, more intimate, more radical relationship with God? So Finding Freedom is here in America. It's the nonprofit that we formed to help let loose more of that kind of journeying, the empowering, people sharing their stories of healing, so that we learn from each other the ways that healing can work in our lives.
And it's amazing how it can affect everybody at different levels, whether it is something that like an addiction or mental health challenges, or simply like, just going through the motions and feeling stuck.
Yep.
And realizing that they're not living their best life.
Yep.
So it's really amazing how that can help. So one thing you talk a lot about is the community healing, the therapeutic community. Can you tell us more about that?
I love therapeutic community. I just have to say.
Yes.
In England, we had a church, and our kind of motto was that we wanted to be a safe place for hurting people. And in fact, it's what I did my PhD focused around, because the church was growing so quickly, relatively speaking, for an English church in a little town. And we actually didn't understand how come people were so enthusiastic about what was going on in this little church. And people talked about the power of change. They said it's amazing to be part of a community where change is real and it's authentic and it's radical. And in Peter's doctoral research, he bumped into this little phrase, therapeutic community. And he contacted the Royal College of Psychiatrists in England, who had a therapeutic community program. And he rang them up and said, we think we might be a therapeutic community. Can you come and check us out? Well, you don't usually become a therapeutic community by accident. So they thought this was a bit amusing, we found out later. And they sent down some of their specialists and they said, well, look at what you're doing. You meet all of the practices of a clinical therapeutic community. You're just a bit different. And there's a long history in Europe of therapeutic communities that support people recovering from trauma. Now, here in America, therapeutic community is usually found in prisons or in specialist addiction communities, but it's not usually in the area of mental health. There's a few, but it's not so common. It's a lot more common in England. And Peter and I became specialists more by accident, I think. In the field of therapeutic community, we worked alongside the Royal College of Psychiatrists Therapeutic Community program, visiting lots of therapeutic communities. And therapeutic community at its heart is the power of relationship to bring change and healing.
It's so powerful.
It's so powerful, Tara. It's not that someone over there who has the expertise and the years of training has the power to bring change in my life, although sometimes they do. But actually, therapeutic community celebrates the space in between relationships. And when those relationships are empowered and authentic, and there's a whole set of guidelines for how those relationships work, then those relationships let loose healing in the community, and the community becomes a container, is one of the words, that holds the safety of the transformation for everyone in the community. One of the little phrases that we use in Finding Freedom is that we like to make miracles contagious. The healing in someone else's life becomes the healing in my life, that becomes the healing in the next person's life as we share our stories and very effectively support each other. And clinicians and specialists are magnificent most of the time, and they have their place. But when you get peer-to-peer relationships of people who are finding radical change, then that brings a dimension that isn't often found in a more clinical or structured counseling or therapeutic relationship.
I so agree. Even just with the book studies, Bible studies, those authentic relationships, our own journey, staying on our side of the street,
Yep.
and letting there be room. I mean, I can totally see the benefits, the growth that has happened in just those communities. That's why I've always been so interested in, what you do, because you do it at a bigger level, but you've got your little pockets and communities, and you've organized it so well that people really can grow to completeness, to wholeness. And it's a really beautiful thing. And there's room, and there's space, and there's respect, and there's authenticity, and it's a beautiful mixture.
Yeah. I think it's so powerful when you let people loose to discover the potential that my story can help let loose your story. And then the relationship, the depth of relationship that is created when I have the privilege of supporting you as you do this radical journey, and then we have the privilege of supporting someone else. It works slightly differently for men and for women. So we have two different models, isn't quite the word, but rhythms, let's call them rhythms, in the way that the communities come together and do their own journey. But it's just as powerful, and how it works. People help people help people, and then when you let God in the mix as well, really there's no stopping that momentum of radical change.
So yes, the therapeutic community has been amazing, and how you guys have empowered that and set up those healing containers. Something that, speaking of stories and empowerment, one thing I really liked was the book Changing Lives?
Change lives, yeah.
Changed Lives, and that was a bunch of different stories. The amazing thing to me was the diversity. Like, you had people struggling with alcoholism, you had people that just were depressed, there were people, they each shared their stories. I mean, you had such mental health issues, you had such a variety, and yet the journey, just where they started to where they were at, and then the still journey, because the journey never quits.
Yep.
But it was really amazing how diverse people's challenges are, and how much that helped. Could you share a few stories?
Sure. Let me just comment on what you said, because I think in Western society, we compartmentalize and we label things. People come to us and they've had a label and they say, I'm one of these, or I've got this problem. I had a call, excuse me, I had a call the other day from someone who said, do you help people with multiple personality disorder? And I said, well, actually, we help anyone, because we do everything we can to avoid the labels. We'll often say sorry to someone for a label that has conditioned them, and then we feel like we become the label. I'm one of these. Well, no, you're not. You struggled with these symptoms, and it might the label might helpfully describe a cluster, and it might give people a clue about where some of that damage comes from, but we are not our label. And
that's huge.
I think, Tara, I agree with you. I think it's really huge, because, well, it's a kind of lazy way of viewing relationships, isn't it? We put people in a box and then we think we understand them. Well, that's hugely insulting. And the same principles of radical healing will work across all those different examples that you've described. Whether if someone's got a struggle going on in their relationship with God, one of the stories in Changed Lives is a pastor who was struggling to feel like he could hear the voice of God. In fact, when he started, he wasn't even sure that that was possible, that God wanted to talk to us in that intimate way. And so that wasn't sickness. That wasn't something radical and traumatic holding back his personal life. It was a specific area of damage in his relationship with God. And he said, something here isn't right. I'm missing a fundamental part of my relationship with God. And so using these same principles and recognizing, maybe someone might recognize the fear that they have in their relationship with God. And they I think of a woman who she had a very traumatic relationship with her father. And many of us build our anticipated relationship with God, the expectations of it, we build on a relationship with a parent, especially father. And so what she had to do was to begin to say, okay, I have to put my relationship with God to one side for a minute. I have to undo the damage layer by layer that I'm carrying in my relationship with my dad. And when that emotion isn't sitting in me, then I don't bring it into my relationship with God, and God can introduce himself in a radically different way. So we have so many people who either find a transformation in their relationship with God, or they meet God for the first time. Maybe, I know, Tara, some of your audience have got really traumatized areas of their relationship with God, perhaps from church damage in the past. And
Yes.
and certainly that was my own experience as well. And to the freedom of being able to look at that church damage and to say that was the church, that wasn't God.
Yes.
And then to walk our way radically through the series of traumas that have got enmeshed in our lives. And when those traumas aren't there, then God can introduce himself in a radically different way if we want him to. And sometimes we might want to wait a while. And God respects that hugely.
Yeah. So you're really talking about a lot of things, like a really soul healing and really coming back to ourselves and being able to reconnect with ourselves, reconnect with our soul, reconnect with God in an authentic way, not like the church's ideals and boxes, but a real authentic way and experience it. And the nice thing is you also give freedom to let people journey how they want, whether it be with God, Jesus, Holy Spirit, or, however that can be done. And there's not that requirement. There's not like, oh, and this is the goal, or this is the thing. There's a radical respect for other people and their journey and where it takes them.
Which is what Jesus did, isn't it?
Yes.
He didn't require that people grasp who he is and accept his lordship. And then if you do that well enough, then I'll heal you. I just find it mind-blowing every time when we read in scripture that Jesus healed everyone who came to him. And
Yes.
then some of them came back and explored relationship with him, and others didn't. And there wasn't a revenge streak in Christ where if they didn't come back, then there was some radical consequence to their healing. Healing was given generously and abundantly. And so that's what we love to do, is to say, we'll often say to people, well, now tell us what your experience is, your spirituality and your relationship with God. And would you like Jesus to be your friend in this healing journey at the moment? Or does that make it more complicated? Because if that makes it more complicated, we leave God on the sidelines and we press in, helping you to find that radical healing, and then you make your own decision about the Lord in whatever way you might want to in the months ahead. You asked me just now about other stories. I'll tell you
Yes.
a story about a guy who he was a father. His son was about 12. His son was about 12, which in England is one of the ages when you change school. This son had gone to a different school, and he'd found himself being bullied. And so this 12-year-old came to see us with the blessing of his parents. They knew us. And he said, I'm being bullied and I don't know what to do. And it was his grades in school had dropped, and it was just becoming quite a complex thing. And you could see the trajectory of what was going to happen over the next few years. And so the first thing that we did with this young man is that we taught him the empty chair. And the empty chair is a very simple therapeutic technique where we showed him how to imagine the kid that was bullying him sitting on the chair in front of him. And we invited this young man, when he was at home, to really let out the words and the feelings that he felt about this bully, which of course he can't do. You never do it to the face of a bully. Why would you do that? That's going to get you into trouble. You start off by doing it when you're out for a walk and you imagine him next to you or on the opposite side of the field. And so we showed this young man how to engage the emotion, the fear, the shame, the anger, all those layers. And this kid did it quite spontaneously when I came back a couple of weeks later, and you could see that he'd grown a bit because he'd been allowed to let it out with any kind of language that he chose, but not to the face of this guy. And so then what we taught him to do was to imagine himself saying it when he was in the presence of this guy without letting it come out of his mouth. So in his spirit, to really let it rise up, let the indignation, how dare you treat me this way, but without it coming out of his mouth. And so he came back a couple of weeks later and he'd grown a bit. And then we taught him how, when the moment was right, to have one encounter with this bully. And I won't go into details, but he was able to stand up to him.
Wonderful.
Because he'd done that inner emotional work first. He'd kind of possessed it in his spirit, and that allowed him. Well, then he comes back, Tara, and he says, something's not right. I can't quite... And he didn't know how to phrase it. And I said to him, how do you feel about manhood? About becoming a young man? And his face dropped. And we started a conversation about the fact that he felt inside that he didn't really want to grow up. And there was a variety of reasons. And some of that was about his relationship with his dad. So then his dad comes in and has a conversation. And his dad starts talking about the conflict that he carries in his own manhood. Mm-hmm. And this guy and Peter had a conversation and started exploring how come dad feels conflicted about being a man, and that was all to do with his father. And so this guy, dad, starts to deal with the damage in his life. I didn't even need to have a conversation with the son, because when a parent lets go of the damage that they carry, then often, depends on circumstances and age and things, but often when a parent lets go of the damage that they carry, that healing overflows in the spiritual landscape of the family. It overflows into the life of the kid. And so that's what happened. This young man was able to take up his manhood, which meant there was no more bullying. And the healing ricocheted from the son back to the father, and then from the father back to the son. It's where we see it so often, that healing becomes a family thing.
That is so powerful. Very powerful. I really saw that also in my own journey with my children, that as I did my own healing, the impact on them.
Yep.
And just, gosh, I see where they're at compared to like 8 years ago. And it's just such a dramatic difference as they're all blooming and blossoming differently. I just celebrated one of my daughter's 21st birthdays, and I just love how she's just grown and bloomed. And a lot of that is just, I did so much work on my own healing. And I feel like that's one of the best things I can give my children, is the best version of me as a healed person and soul.
Absolutely.
And so I've really seen that impact. That's such a powerful story of that young man and his father.
Yeah. We have lots of people who come and say, my kid's got this problem. And we always want to say, let's sit down and chat with you first.
Yes.
And then Tara, there's that difficulty, isn't there, where the kid's an adult now, and you get to see the damage in the adult kid's life. And we have lots of people who come and they say, well, I feel like I might have contributed to the trauma that my kid's going through, my adult kid is going through. And it's a challenging thing as a parent to not be able to make it better. And so we'll sit with the parent and walk through some steps to help the parent lay down maybe some of the guilt that they're feeling, the powerlessness of no longer being able to make it perfect and beautiful. And there's a healing for the parent to be free from whatever piece of guilt or shame they might be carrying. Whether or not the adult kid then receives it, you set the parent free to become more of who they're created to be without feeling that connection and responsibility. And God's perspective always wants to bring that healing to us without us being trapped and dependent on how that healing helps someone, whether someone else moves into that healing or not.
I think that's really huge in my age group as I get older, because we start to have adult children. Mm-hmm. And just like you said, we see like, oh gosh, how I impact. I always tell my kids, first 5 counseling sessions on me. I love you, and I'm sure I've messed you up in some way. But the truth is, like, that's really important, because I talk to a lot of friends that they'll look at where their kids are at and they have blame or guilt on themselves. And like, just like you said, doing their own journey, and then also freeing that gives like a spiritual freedom for their children to travel in their own journey, and just trusting in that.
Yes.
So
yes, whether it goes in the direction that we want it to, or whether it doesn't, being free as a parent to respect our kids' choice, and then being free to press on in our own journey without that being kind of inextricably attached to the decisions that our adult kid will make.
Yes. That's fabulous.
We often find womanhood gets stereotyped. Science is kind of catching on to what Scripture has said all along, which is that there's an inherited dimension of our emotional life, and it's now being mapped at a kind of molecular level. How does trauma get passed on from one generation to the next? So our church is a safe place, and it's heartbreaking that so many churches aren't. We want to be vulnerable and open to God, so then we want to be vulnerable and open to those who represent God. And then if that trust gets abused, there's a deeper part of us that gets harmed. But abundance has to begin with the foundation that God intended for us. But if we press into that radical transformation and allow it to grow and permeate spontaneously through all the different areas of our life, then abundant life is who we're created to be.
Stay tuned for our next episode.